From your favorite podcatchers and our YouTube channel featuring scenic videos, this is Kaiju Vision Radio, Episode 21, The Return of Godzilla. Hello, G-fans and Kaiju lovers, and welcome to Kaiju Vision Radio, a podcast about the appreciation of giant monster movies
and discovering their historical and cultural value.
I'm Nathan Marchand.
And I'm Brian Scherschel.
And in today's episode, we are starting the Heisei series of Godzilla films with The Return of Godzilla, the original Japanese version of what was later known as Godzilla 1985.
Yes, we're doing this version first, and then we're doing the other movie after this episode next week.
Yep, just like we did with Gojira and Godzilla King of the Monsters.
Because they're so different, obviously. In case anybody that doesn't know, there's a huge difference. So what we're going to be doing with this episode is catching up on some stuff that happened before this movie was made, and then we'll be catching up on doing a lot of other work, and we're going to move forward. Because we had some years in between these movies, finally.
A 9-year gap.
So one movie a year for almost 1 year movie for 1 movie a year for a very long time.
Oh yeah.
and finally we're back 9 years later. I'm really excited to do this movie though. This is such a huge one. Really, really huge one. And so our related topics for this podcast are the acceleration of the Cold War, NATO's Able Archer exercise, Korean Airlines Flight 007, and the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. What we're going to do, since this movie is really related to a lot of the issues that we're going to be discussing in part 3, we're going to do the more, all the political analysis in part 3, and then we're going to do more of the rest of it in part 2. And so we'll be catching up on the politics after we do our standard discussion of the movie.
All right, Brian, with that, let's get to our first film description of the Heisei era. You're listening to Kaiju Vision Radio.
Godzilla is a ferocious force of nature. It's never stated if he is the original Godzilla or another member of the same species. He seeks nuclear energy to consume by attacking a Soviet submarine and a Japanese nuclear power plant, but he attacks Tokyo with no apparent motivation. Goro Maki is an intrepid reporter who finds the hard-working fisherman Hiroshi Okumura aboard the Yahata Maru and tries to break the story, only to have it censored by the government. Hiroshi's intelligent and loving sister Naoko is an intern working for Dr. Hayashida. The three of them later assist with research to stop Godzilla. The brilliant Dr. Makoto Hayashida is a scientist studying Godzilla because his parents died in the 1954 attack. The shrewd Prime Minister Mitamura finds himself pressured from both the United States and the Soviet Union to allow the use of nuclear weapons. The human and kaiju plotline intermix is high. For the most part, the humans' actions are connected to Godzilla, and they are frequently affected by him. The JSDF attacks Godzilla with fighter jets, tanks, rocket launchers, and assault rifles, but Godzilla destroys them all. Hyper laser cannons are ineffective against him. A floating fortress called the Super X attacks Godzilla using flares and cadmium missiles, which render him unconscious. He's revived by an electrical storm generated by an atmospheric nuclear blast and destroys the Super X. The problem is solved when Dr. Hayashida activates his magnetic transmitter, which attracts Godzilla to the mouth of Mount Mihara. Bombs are detonated to create an eruption, and Godzilla falls into the volcano. The screenplay by Shuichi Nagahara, which was heavily revised from several previous scripts by other writers, is a relatively simple story with a few small subplots. The film was given a healthy budget of $6.25 million. Special effects director Teruyoshi Nakano, with his final G film, produced what he said was his best work in the genre. While employing traditional methods such as suitmation, animation, and miniatures, he also built a 16-foot robotic Godzilla and a life-size replica of Godzilla's foot to be used in some shots. Godzilla was redesigned to resemble the 1954 original and include elements that denoted sadness. This was the first film where stuntman Kenpachiro Satsuma played Godzilla. This film returns to its roots with a dark, often bleak tone. It depicts extraordinary events in a realistic setting, albeit with minor sci-fi elements. Since this is essentially a remake of the original Gojira with elements of Rodan, it isn't a very experimental film. This film reinforces the style of the 1954 original with its apocalyptic imagery, anti-nuclear themes, nationalistic politics, and often poetic storytelling. While the original film's story was firmly entrenched in the occupation era, this time the story is firmly entrenched in the Cold War era. This was the culmination of many attempts made by producer Tomoyuki Tanaka, among others, since the late 1970s to revive the Godzilla franchise. Tanaka wanted to get away from Godzilla's anthropomorphic hero persona, so the film was written as a sequel to 1954's original Gojira. The movie was intended to appeal to an adult kaiju audience familiar with the original classic while serving as a jumping-on point for newcomers. When released in Japan on December 15, 1984, it grossed a reasonable $11 million and sold 3.2 million tickets, making it the most popular Godzilla film since 1966's Ebirah Horror of the Deep. The film was substantially altered by New World Pictures when released stateside 8 months later. Scenes were trimmed or deleted, and new scenes were filmed and inserted, lessening the political content and radically changing the tone. Despite this, it is 16 minutes shorter than the Japanese cut. This version was so drastically different we'll be addressing it in our next episode. Japan finds itself caught between the United States and the Soviet Union, who are both pressuring the nation to allow the use of nuclear weapons to kill Godzilla. The Japanese government enacts a media blackout on all news stories related to the destruction of the Yahata Maru, but they later reveal everything to the public. Japan unveils a secretly developed defense weapon, the Super X. Both the United States and the Soviet Union have orbital nuclear platforms from which they can launch missiles. Godzilla attacks a Soviet submarine, causing an international incident. Japan's nuclear plants attract Godzilla to the mainland. The most potent anti-nuclear sentiment since the original Gojira is expressed throughout the film. It indicts not only nuclear weapons, but possibly nuclear power plants. Prime Minister Mitamura is presented as a hero for standing up to the Americans and Soviets in favor of Japan's principles. This is also shown by Goro when he disregards the media blackout to tell Naoko about her brother. Dr. Hayashida admits that he first studied Godzilla to avenge his parents' deaths during the 1954 rampage, but he now sympathizes with the creature. He later states that when nature is out of balance, monsters appear, which means Godzilla is a sign of coming end times for humanity. An almost nihilistic helplessness in the face of nature's fury pervades the film. Godzilla is presented as a tragic creature and perhaps as a victim of the nuclear age at the end. This concludes part 1 of the podcast. You're listening to Kaiju Vision Radio.
Part 2 of the podcast will be our opinion and discussion of the film in this week's episode. So, Brian, what's your take on this one?
It is one of my absolute favorite Godzilla movies ever.
Which is saying a lot. And
I like almost all of these.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because this version, the original Japanese version, is the most recent one to be brought over to the United States. Finally.
Yeah, it took a long time.
It took a very, very long time.
The Blu-ray and then the latest treatment of it is beautiful, though.
Oh yeah, it is. It is fantastic, and it was really exciting when it finally came over. In fact, actually, wasn't it number 1 on Amazon in the foreign films category?
Yeah,
because that's how big of a deal this was.
Mm-hmm.
So
for a very long time that nobody could get it.
Yeah.
I actually saw this version first too.
Really?
I did not see 85 until right after I had finished 84. I saw them both at the same time.
Wow, that's interesting because I grew up on 85.
Yeah, I got to actually see 84 before 85, so I could...
Lucky you.
I chose to do that so that I could see I think that's the right order to do it.
It really is.
And then you see the one that they made after it. So you get to see it just like everybody else saw it. And seeing this movie, after seeing all of them in chronological order... that makes this one even more insanely good.
Yes, it does. And
it's jarring. It's the most jarring change yet in this franchise.
Yeah.
It totally is a completely different movie. We are ditching the 70s movies.
We're ditching the Showa era and most of the Showa era entirely.
Well, yeah, pretty much all the 60s. Almost everything.
Yeah. Something that I've mentioned periodically in this podcast is I've been noticing with these Godzilla movies that there are certain trends that Toho beat Hollywood to decades before Hollywood was doing these sorts of things. And with this one, it's the reboot.
Yeah, reboot.
Yeah, Toho was doing reboots 20 years before Hollywood started making it a huge craze. And I think that's really interesting, and that's why it fits in with what you're talking about, with this being such a jarring transition. It's because it is totally unlike anything that people had been seeing for, I think it would probably be close to 20 years in the Godzilla franchise at this point.
Right. We're also pretending that none of these other movies ever existed.
Except for the original.
Right. So this is, forget everything you've seen except the first one up to now. That's what this whole strategy is. And it's a good idea to reboot this because, I mean, after all of the stuff we've been through so far in this, talk about all the changes that we've been through and how Godzilla has changed over the decades so far. It really it's asking for a reboot.
Yeah, so it's both a reboot and a sequel? So it's a requel?
Yeah. Uh-huh. It is also, though, it is one of the most elevated movies in the franchise.
That's a good way to put it.
This is into the stratosphere as far as amazing how much this movie brings up and how much it connects to, and how there's a normal first time that you see this, and I think I'd just absorb what I saw the first time I see it, and then I'd see it again just so I could say, okay, what is going on, and then pay attention to all of this politics and all that whole dimension, because it's huge.
I get the impression that this one is a little bit overlooked. Even the Japanese version is a little bit overlooked by the fan base. They always seem to gravitate more toward the later Heisei movies, when there's so many interesting things in this one. Particularly if, as we'll illustrate in part 3, if you have a greater understanding of what was going on in the Cold War at the time.
And we're also going back to referring to Godzilla as it.
Yeah, I know.
It now. When it's not he, so it goes along with how we have the no longer
he's not a character anymore,
or a superhero, or any of this other stuff that he morphed in and out of through all these movies. Which I don't think we're saying that before this it was bad. I think it was great.
No, not
actually.
at all.
But that's what makes Godzilla so fun, is that we've had all these different kinds of movies. But because you can't do this movie every time.
No, you can't.
No, this is really unique and individual. So we have to really take this in and see what all it offers, because there is a lot that it offers. It's also interesting that we've gone from Godzilla as a nuclear allegory and symbolism to a living nuclear reactor.
Yeah. Which becomes a big thing for, I know, at least the rest of the Heisei era.
Because he is a nuclear weapon now.
Yeah, actually, he gets described as a
nuclear reactor and a nuclear bomb.
Yeah, Hayashida said he's a living nuclear weapon that doesn't care about anybody.
And he's immortal. He is immortal.
I'm just going to keep saying he.
I don't know. It sounds funny.
Yeah, it does.
I refer to xenomorph as it. But
that makes sense, though. That. Yeah.
It's totally different. But anyway, but I think, he's literally a nuclear weapon, and he's immortal. And so we've.
I kind of want to know how he figured that out, but I just.
I don't know how you figure out if somebody's immortal or not.
I mean, he just kind of presents himself as like, I am the resident Godzilla expert. Godzilla is immortal. I'm like, I'd like to know how you know that.
Well, I mean, I don't know. If somebody came up to me and said, hey, I'm immortal, I'd be like, oh, yeah? Let's find out.
Yeah, let me get my sword. I'll cut your head off.
Yeah, where's the proof? Let's see.
Godzilla is Highlander.
This movie is a dark film,
figuratively and literally.
Mm-hmm. But it isn't. Well, it's not like the last movie we saw.
Terror of Mechagodzilla.
That was dark, weird dark.
Dark TM.
Dark, yeah, trademark dark, with the extremely appropriate music for that kind of a thing. You know, mm-hmm. and then we go to guys whipping each other and stuff, and
which is supposed to be dark but is unintentionally funny.
At least they weren't playing the music during that.
Oh god.
But the point is, the music for this movie, which by the way is possibly the most incredible music in the Godzilla series.
I love the music in this one.
So far up there on the list. I don't know if it's at the top, but my gosh. But that isn't dark, quotation marks.
It's very moody, though.
It's moody, but it is so appropriate. But it isn't just this music that is just screaming dark.
Yeah, it's more subdued.
It's more appropriate. But the atmosphere of this movie is way more. It has so much more continuity than the movies we've been seeing.
Yes,
this has atmospheric continuity. I like the atmosphere.
Yeah,
it's a good kind of dark.
Yeah,
it makes sense.
Yeah, and the imagery that it's fit into is just. I think it's actually for me personally, it's some of the most unique imagery in the entire franchise. And believe it or not, Brian, this actually, I mentioned before that there's a movie we're going to get to a little bit later that inspired my kaiju novella that I have out there, Destroyer. You can buy it on Amazon. But this one actually inspired a short story that I had published in an anthology.
Oh.
Particularly the scenes after the nuclear collision, and you have the red sky and the really moody music and all of that sequence right there. It's actually fairly short. I remembered it being longer, but that right there it really got my imagination going, and I wrote a kind of a post-apocalyptic kaiju story centered around that. The idea of it being that you had this apocalypse brought about by a kaiju that then kind of gets worshipped as a god, and then there are the characters that you follow in the short story are defying their culture that thinks of the kaiju as a god, so they can escape the city that they've been trapped in.
Oh, so it's a question of how the kaiju is viewed.
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
The divide, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'll show you the story sometime, but those scenes are specifically what inspired it.
Getting back to the whole Heisei Showa thing, yeah, this is when the Heisei movies start. It's my strong belief, though, that this movie should maybe not be part of the so-called Heisei series. It was released when Emperor Showa was alive, and if you're going to do this kind of a naming anyway, then shouldn't you do it right? But anyway, it also works more as a bookend for the Showa series, this movie. Because you have the first movie and then you have this. And so those work as bookends. But also it's a great movie to end with for the Showa series instead of 75. It also doesn't have much to do with the rest of the Heisei movies. Stylistically even, story-wise, they look different.
They do. It still is technically connected with continuity.
Looks different?
Yeah.
Because this one is a one-off costume, right?
Yeah, it wasn't recycled.
Yeah, and we don't get to see it again. And
no.
So I don't know. It's just I understand, and also this. I know it's a reboot movie. That's why.
Yeah.
I almost want to hold a moment of silence to say goodbye to Toho Scope because I love how those movies look.
Yeah.
This Toho Scope. This looks fine. It's widescreen.
The Heisei movies were filmed at a different aspect ratio.
Yeah. I just prefer the Toho Scope, really, but I don't know. This looks okay. I can live with it. But
yeah, I miss Toho Scope too.
I just feel like Toho Scope's like one of the ultimate ways to film these movies, but I understand why.
Right from the beginning, this film tells the audience that this is going to be completely different than what they've been used to for a long time. The opening credits in this, which do get copied for the most part stylistically in the Americanized version, it opens up with the slow reveal of the title, and it's filled, all the text is all filled with fire and lava, with the really ominous music. It's not intense, scary music, but it's very ominous music.
It's definitely monster movie music.
Oh yeah, most definitely. And then it shows you the title after that extreme close-up, after you see the letters kind of form a little bit. The movie actually opens a bit like a horror film.
It does. It almost sounds like music for a vampire movie.
Almost. Because there's a lot. It
ties into the whole Vampzilla thing with the fangs.
The first thing that happens is a fishing vessel gets attacked. Mm-hmm. And it comes out of nowhere. They don't know what hit them. and stuff like that, which actually in a lot of ways makes the juxtaposition once you go from that opening scene when you just hear Godzilla's roar as he comes out of the island to the next. It's a bit jarring because it's daytime, it's a different boat, and they're playing that J-pop song on the radio.
Yeah,
it's a little bit weird, but I think there's a reason for that. It's meant to be a contrast because everything's completely different, and then so it's like here's a guy having a normal day, and then the Exposition News Network breaks in and starts giving us all information about what's been going on with the boat, and then this guy realizes, oh wait, that's the boat, and then he goes on there, and then when he's exploring the boat, there's this really effective use of silence, and there's mystery. You don't know what's going on.
Yeah, that has a horror film.
Yeah, very much a horror film. Confined spaces. They even found ways to visually communicate other tactile sensations in this. Because I'm a writer, and they always tell us when we're writing to put as much tactile description as you can in there.
It's like they were doing a novelization of this, and then they just made it into a scene.
Yeah, because he does things like he opens up a door to another room, and he covers his mouth and nose because he's smelling decay.
Yeah, it totally gets all cinematic with us right there, and then the slime that our creature,
the sea louse, the Shakarus or whatever. I looked up its name, and it has a really funny sounding name. So it was all very interesting, and you've got corpses and blood and all of these things. So it's really
guys in lockers passed out.
Yeah, that's really building this horror atmosphere. Although I have to admit, with the guy in the locker just made me think of all these new survival horror video games where one of the mechanics is hiding in lockers.
Yeah, it's very horror filmy, but also there is a nod to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in this.
Really?
Because he enters the dark room, and then there's the person sitting in the chair.
Oh, yeah. And, now I get it.
And then he slowly swivels the chair around, and it's this mummified, very psycho moment there. That's nice that they put that in there. The movie was from 1960, and this is 24 years later, but better late than never, I guess.
Wow, I can't believe I never thought of that. Well, you're the Hitchcock expert, so obviously
my brain just about went crazy when I saw that. I was like, wait, I've seen this 100 million times. Here it is. Wow, awesome.
I just wish, as wonderful as that buildup is, I do kind of wish that the sea louse looked a little bit better as the payoff.
Well, when it flies at him, it's pretty that's kind of funny.
Yeah,
it flies through the air like diagonally.
Yeah, it's a little unconvincing when it's flying around. When you have the close-ups,
it looks better.
It looks better when you very much get the sense that the thing's heavy and it's it really wants to suck him dry.
And it is it is pretty gross.
Oh yeah,
still.
Very gross.
Yeah, it's pretty gross still.
Yeah, it's just when it's flying around, it looks a little disappointing.
A little funny there, but not overall pretty good.
Yeah,
I applaud them for even doing that scene, because they could have just had it, not had it maybe, I don't know. And then the song that is playing on there, the J-pop song.
Yeah,
isn't our actress? Doesn't she sing that? She's a pop star, right?
Or the Naoko? Yeah, I don't remember actually. I'd have to look that up.
Chick who sang the song.
I love the scene at the nuclear power plant and how it's handled, because it's a POV shot from Godzilla.
Yeah,
and you hear
is that maybe the first time that we've even?
I think so, actually. And I just love how it's handled, because it's very subtle and creepy, because it's that
like
POV shot.
It's like you're in a tall building and it's moving.
Yeah, it's moving, and you hear Godzilla growl really low, and then the nuclear power plant is revealed in the fog because it's very foggy.
Mm-hmm.
So at first you're not sure what's going on. You're probably thinking, well, maybe Godzilla's in the fog. But no, then once it starts to clear, you see the power plant, you realize, oh, wait, no, this is a POV shot.
Yeah.
And then you have that wonderful full body reveal of Godzilla. And then we're talking, this is about 30 minutes into the movie, about 33 minutes.
Yeah, 30.
And you have that security guard just wandering out there minding his own business, and then he sees Godzilla and the camera pans up.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so effective. And I'm like, one of the thoughts that went through my head when I saw this, my gosh, Godzilla is scary again.
And bigger.
And bigger. Yeah, he was 50 meters tall through the Showa era. Now he's 80 meters tall.
And it's because of, what did they say? That the skyline of Tokyo was...
The skyline of Tokyo was bigger, and if they kept him 50 meters, he would look really tiny.
Right. Is this our first movie with the Prime Minister in it?
We've seen a lot of government officials in these movies, but I don't think we've seen a Prime Minister yet. At least not an obvious...
Not named.
Yeah. Not
singled out, really.
Yeah, not an obvious Prime Minister. This is definitely the first time we've had a Prime Minister in a Godzilla movie as a character.
As a character, for sure, yeah. It's always like this leadership committee with military people and everybody else sitting around, but we don't get anybody saying Prime Minister. We don't get anybody referring to somebody as Sori. We get that now. And that's what Sori is the honorable title for the Prime Minister. It's kind of like saying Mr. President.
Yeah, I was going to say it's like Mr. President.
Yeah. So that's new, but this is the first time we've actually seen the big guy in charge of the government of Japan. It's very interesting. The actor that plays him is very good.
He might be my favorite character in this movie.
There's a lot of gravity to it, to the character for sure, and it's just somehow relatable. I don't know. If you're Japanese, especially, it would be relatable. And I don't. This guy isn't supposed to be anybody in particular.
No.
This isn't supposed to be the Prime Minister at the time, and they weren't doing that.
And this is kind of getting a little bit ahead of things, but I feel like the Prime Minister is the character who suffers the most in the re-edits for the Americanized version, because a lot of his scenes get cut. Yeah,
because the cutting was dependent on shoving as much action into it and getting rid of the talky parts.
Which is really unfortunate, but
even though the talkie parts are some of the best parts, just like in a lot of Star Trek episodes and movies and stuff, that sometimes the moments like what the Prime Minister has in these movies is some of those are some of the best ones. You don't need action and everything to have it be memorable. If you're gonna have government scenes like this in a movie, you have to have there's like a critical mass of them that you have to have time-wise. You have to have that fleshed out enough so that the audience knows exactly what's going on, which we do in this.
And actually, that's something I think is to the film's credit, is the first time I saw the Japanese version of this, I didn't know as much about Japanese politics as I do now, and yet I was still able to understand the weight of what the Prime Minister was dealing with. I was given enough information within the film that I got it.
There wasn't something that you needed to read before you went in.
Yeah. And that's astonishing considering that I was not the target audience for this. I'm an American. And
the target audience was Japanese.
The target audience was Japanese, so all of this was, they already knew. It was part of the zeitgeist, part of the culture. They understood all of that.
And it was all recent news.
It was all recent news. But I was able to understand where he was coming from, despite my ignorance at the time. And now, knowing what I know now, there's even a greater sense.
Yeah, after we've talked about this subject for 2.5 years.
Yeah. I mean, there's an even greater sense now of the gravity and what was going on. I understand the original context much better.
We do get an interesting Showa era repeat in this movie because we get the reporter, we get the news organization, and we get the scientists.
Yes.
And so it's
the sorts of character archetypes that we're used to.
And so that's classical in that way. And we're not going around with aliens and all this other stuff that we've been doing.
It's a much more grounded kaiju film, like the movies from the 50s. I mean, it has a little bit of sci-fi in it because the Super X is very much a science fiction-y kind of vehicle, and they have the laser cannons.
Yeah, that's sci-fi-ish. Yeah, and then there's also like a fantasy element to this too, because of Godzilla being attracted to the nuclear plants and absorbing the nuclear energy.
Yeah,
it reminds me of nuclear energy, and specifically radiation in this movie is a little bit like magic, because Godzilla can just magically absorb all of the radiation.
Yeah, he feeds on it.
So you can destroy a nuclear power plant and just be, it's fine.
Yeah.
and so that's not really, you can't scientifically explain it.
No,
because
but
it's Godzilla, right?
Yeah.
But then you have to. But then, yeah, I think there's always a fantasy element to any Godzilla movie because I think Godzilla is a fantasy creature. At this point now especially, he's a living nuclear bomb and he's immortal. And so, like, how science fiction can you really get when the base of it is fantasy-esque?
And well, it's also a nice expansion of the Godzilla mythos because they had never really explained what Godzilla eats or anything. And in this one, they're saying that he feeds off of nuclear energy. That's his sustenance, and it plays into the longstanding themes with Godzilla related to nuclear power and nuclear weapons and such.
But at the same time, he still just wanders into Tokyo with no apparent motivation.
Yeah, which is really odd because you would think that if
there's
he's
nothing
going
there that he wants.
Yeah, if he's going to I mean, it makes sense initially where he's looking for the nuclear power plants, but then he goes to Tokyo because
you have to. Right?
Yeah, it's what you do in these movies.
Yeah, you don't need to go to any extra work to explain that.
No, but I think it also adds to Godzilla's mystique. Godzilla is a symptom of nature being out of balance, and when nature's out of balance, it produces monsters. So he said Godzilla is a sign of end times for humanity because it's, I guess, implicit in that statement is he's saying it's humanity's fault that nature's out of balance, and it's specifically because they have dabbled in nuclear power.
Yeah, and so it's pretty easy. It seems like there's also a little bit of economic doom to this too, because Japan has really gone in leaps and bounds growth-wise since the original Gojira. And so it just seems like we get that, like we talked about in King Kong versus Godzilla, the economic miracle being, the benefits of it being destroyed in the blink of an eye. I think we're getting that back too. We're getting a lot of Godzilla themes all at once here, really. Another one of my favorite scenes is definitely when the Shinkansen is downtown in Shinjuku and Gojira picks it up, and that whole scene is very, like, you have to do that, right?
Yeah, it's actually reminiscent.
We were due for a scene like this.
Yeah, I think it's an homage to a similar scene in the original. Kong. Well, and also in the original film because he goes after a train in that. Yeah,
but this time it's the Shinkansen because you can tell because it's the blue and white bullet train, and it's shown twice, I think, actually, throughout the movie at least.
I think so.
Mm-hmm. But it's very. You can tell that was another reason that they put the Shinkansen in there was to just. I mean, you have to have it. It's new.
I paid very close attention to those scenes involving the prime minister and the diplomats from the Soviet Union and the United States, partly because of all the stuff that we've been researching and learning, and just seeing the very different attitudes that we're getting in this. I think for a lot of American audience members, they're getting a very different side of the Cold War in this. We're used to seeing the Cold War from a very American sort of perspective. And in this one, we're focusing on a country that's not one of the superpowers. It's a country that's caught in the middle of it. And you get that in microcosm in that boardroom scene when the prime minister is meeting with those two diplomats, and they have different attitudes, but there's both advocating the same thing. You need to let us use nuclear weapons to stop Godzilla.
The Soviets even seem a little bit more bossy and forceful about it.
Well, that's because they lost a sub because of Godzilla. So it's I think for the Soviets, they're taking it a little bit more personally because they lost something. The Americans, I think, are just worried that this is going to escalate tensions and escalate the conflict. But
the Americans are more concerned with using nuclear weapons to get rid of Godzilla and then go back to normal.
Yeah. And that's why the scene that's after this, when the prime minister is meeting with his advisors and trying to figure out what he needs to do. It's very, very interesting because one of the advisors actually tells him that he feels like Japan is being used as part of an experiment to test nukes in a small-scale conflict.
Yeah, they don't want to be the guinea pig. And then they put the shoe on the other foot, and they asked, what if this was New York City or Washington or Moscow?
Yeah.
Would you use a nuke then? And then that's when they realized that, there's a lot of gravity to that decision.
Yeah, it silences them right there. Yeah. And I think that it's such a good response. It's such an interesting response. And then, because before that, the prime minister comes out and says, here's my decision. We're standing by the 3 non-nuclear principles, which is something we've talked about in the previous episode. That means we will not possess, we will not harbor, we will not use nuclear weapons on Japanese soil. That's my decision.
Yes, he reasserts that policy.
Yeah. And the Russian diplomat responds to that by saying that's egotism. He calls the Japanese arrogant, essentially, for doing that. And
Mr. Rosenberg, that's what it was, wasn't it? He says, this is no time to be thinking about principles.
Yeah. So again, you're getting two very different attitudes that are trying to get at the same results, pretty much. And Mitamura makes a very shrewd response, which is, isn't it egotism that both the Soviet Union and the United States are constantly clamoring to get more nuclear weapons as a deterrent against each other?
Right.
That's why it's so fascinating to look at this, because it's a completely different angle on the Cold War.
Is it different from Vietnam or Korea too? Because they were, even though they were both in specific wars, and they were really caught in the middle of the Cold War. But Japan, there wasn't a war there during the Cold War, and yet they're still in the middle of everything.
So, Brian, I want to ask you something here. Do you think that the Prime Minister more or less enacts the U.S.-Japanese alliance after they find out about the Soviet missile that had been launched?
That is definitely what's going on.
Because it's not something that we're used to seeing.
We don't.
We're used to seeing the Japanese try to deal with everything themselves.
Yeah, through all of these movies, we've seen that. But now, finally, we have America being depicted in a movie like this.
The Soviets are presented as being a bit pushier. They're reasonable because they do respect Japan's wishes. Because there's that scene on the boat where they said, oh, yeah, they won't let us use it, so we're going to
turn it off.
It off. The Americans just seem just a little bit disappointed. They're upset, but they're also being respectful.
SMH, they were shaking their head at the result because it wasn't exactly what they wanted, but they had to just go with it. In that scene, we have both the Soviet Union and the United States agreeing on something, which is also, part of that is sort of, ha-ha, for once, that happened. But it also definitely shows how, in a corner, the Prime Minister was being put in by this.
Call me crazy, Brian, but the score in this movie, we've mentioned it, it's a fantastic score. I felt like in some ways it had some shades of a Fukabe in it, because there are points where he does get a little bit bigger and more bombastic, but it's also very much its own thing. So I guess what I'm saying is it feels like Godzilla music without being a carbon copy of a Fukabe.
Which I think was needed by this time. This is another good way to get something fresh into these movies, and I think it works perfectly. And
I find it actually kind of a little bit ironic that the Super X gets its own little hero theme.
And the military has its own theme too, which I like both of them.
Yeah, but every time the Super X shows up, it has this similar sort of music cue that gets played, and it's kind of a nice rousing military march sort of a thing. It's like, oh, here comes the Super X.
Yeah, it gets a fanfare.
I really do feel like the special effects in this movie are really ambitious. They tried a lot of new things in this that don't really get replicated later. I think that might partly be because of money, or maybe they just didn't feel like they were as effective as they wanted them to be. But it's just so interesting, because building, the 16-foot robot Godzilla that they used in some shots, kind of like,
not going to do that in every movie.
No, I mean, yeah, but the giant foot that's in a couple of shots. I mean, that those were not cheap. Those obviously were not cheap.
No, and part of this also is a lot of it's economics. The economics were doing really well in Japan right now at this time in '84, and so this was after 1990, especially. We're going to see more problems occur just because the budgets get hurt with these movies during the '90s, and the film industry during the '90s in Japan was very interesting.
And I think my favorite special effects sequences in this movie has to be Godzilla's battles with the Super X, because you see a lot of different special effects techniques, a lot of different filming techniques are all on display during those sequences. The close-up of Godzilla's face, that's obviously a very articulate puppet. And such, so you're getting a lot of reaction shots and all of the animated laser beams and the rockets and everything that are getting fired, and then the thing maneuvering around between the model buildings.
Right,
it all looks very effective, and it's even a little bit ironic that the Super X seemingly defeats Godzilla right after the Soviet missile gets launched. I was like, oh, we dealt with one problem. Oh, wait, there's a new one. Yeah. We can't do anything about it.
Yeah, there's a very nice ticking clock to the later parts of this movie. There's always something happening.
Yeah, and the same thing goes for our human characters that we're following get put in peril as they're trapped in a building, and then they have
a pretty long time.
For a long time, and then they have
a lot of stuff happens that they miss.
Yeah, and then they have to be rescued with a helicopter, and that's a very tense scene, and that was actually very well done, because some of those shots it's a real helicopter, and some shots it's miniatures. And obviously with a set for the window, and
people spend some time on it.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that they did to make that scene effective.
I wonder how much of this movie being good, how much of that was just time.
Could have been. I think they did spend a little more time than usual on this one.
Yeah, there's a lot of, when you have a 9-year break like this, you want to make something that makes an impact.
Oh yeah,
you don't want to just have something like Terror of Mechagodzilla again after all these years, and after all, you're going to have to change the way you're doing things and update things, and so you have to really, I think they were trying pretty hard on this. They put a lot of time, work into this.
Yeah, and what makes that sequence great is a lot of it is taking place after the Super X has incapacitated Godzilla, and the tension is so thick that you actually forget that Godzilla is around. I had to remind myself, I was like, oh wait, Godzilla's still around in this, because all those other things take center stage.
Yeah, and it's a long, well put together sequence. All the missiles and then the impact, and it's a very long sequence, I think, of just all the events that are lined up, bam, 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 one after the other.
Yeah, and I really like the shot when you get to the end of that, when Godzilla defeats the Super X, and he's blasted a hole in a building just so he could hit the Super X, because they think, oh, we'll hide behind the skyscraper. Nope, he shoots right through it, and then it lands on the street, and then Godzilla just pushes the building over, and just that lingering shot of Godzilla just standing over everything. Mm-hmm. That's a little bit scary.
Yeah.
I mean, he really does look like some sort of just evil god that has just smote the tiny mortals. He's just looming over it. It's almost Lovecraftian in some ways.
I think now when people see the building collapse, it's aged, because the building wouldn't have done that. right?
Probably not.
Yeah, just go from vertical to horizontal and stay put together. Yeah. But, it was a more innocent time when people didn't see buildings falling over on a regular basis like some do. Did they evacuate Tokyo? Because there are a lot of people there. I know people have talked about this, right? It's like there's an audience there and everything. All the nuclear stuff's raining down on us. Oh, well, this is so cool to look at. We're not going to leave.
Yeah, I was noticing that.
It's like when people have a hurricane advisories and stuff. You need to evacuate. Nope, I'm staying. Godzilla's coming to town. Like, I'm going to leave. I don't know. It's funny.
There were mentions of evacuations, but I guess some people just didn't want to leave. They wanted to watch.
They're just late.
Yeah, I feel sorry for them because you have that scene early on when Godzilla comes to Tokyo when he shoots the helicopter out of the sky and then it crashes on that overpass and then it just starts this chain reaction where all of the cars blow up. I'm just thinking, crap.
I looked at that and I was like, dang, I hope that doesn't happen here ever in real life. I don't know what would cause that. But I mean,
it's not every day a helicopter gets shot out of the sky.
I think when audiences see that now, they're surprised because it's this chain reaction. It's like dominoes.
Yeah,
it's like a domino chain of explosions all the way down the elevated highway, and I'm like, wow.
Well,
okay.
As we've established,
that really went out of control.
Yeah, well, but as we've established, Nakano loves his explosions.
I figured since it's him doing it, I almost would have figured more explosions to be in this.
Yeah, it's a little.
You think they would have
scaled back a little bit on the explosions?
Compared to what we've been seeing lately, yeah.
We also have a shot at the end when Godzilla is coming over the hill, and you see his face come up first, and then the rest of him. There's a shot like that actually in Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla from 1974. Now,
yeah, it is.
Yeah. Now, mind you,
a lot of similarities.
Yeah. Now, mind you, that one in 74, it's supposed to be kind of this heroic reveal, but in this one, it's the context is very different. This is kind of a Godzilla is marching to his doom sort of a thing. He's being attracted away and about to be sealed away in a volcano. So it's much more bittersweet in this one.
Yeah, especially with all the music at the end getting all emotional with us.
Yes.
We've started getting more science-y in these movies. It seems like I'm watching the beginning of the formation of G-Force. I feel like this is the foreshadowing or prelude to G-Force because that's going to be a thing later. Mm-hmm. But it just seemed like, okay, we're going to start applying real scientific principles to something that totally isn't real, but they're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, that's very much a science fiction trope. At least trying to make some sort of sense, some sort of justification for what's going on, even if it does mean kind of embellishing a little bit. If it sounds good, if it sounds reasonable, sounds feasible, audiences usually go with it.
But at the same time, aren't you taking away a little bit of the mystique of Godzilla every time you do that? Because you just said that he's immortal. And then you're applying scientific principles to him at the same time.
I can see where you're coming from with that.
Because we're going to be applying over the movies ahead of us. There are going to be a lot of scientific principles applied to him.
This is true.
And this also gets to the other point of one thing that I've noticed throughout these movies, and that is, where did the extra 15 minutes come from? Now, we've talked about this before, but with movies from this one on for quite a while, the movies are about 1 hour and 41 to 1 hour and 45
generally-ish
minutes. There's a different time length to these movies.
And before they were more about 80, 90 minutes.
90-ish. Yeah, 85, 90, 95. Somewhere around there. But it was pretty predictable throughout the Showa series that they'd be about that long, which I would think somebody out there's got to agree with me, but I think 1 hour and 30 minutes fits very well for an average Godzilla movie. And I feel like 145 feels long for the amount of, considering the amount of content that's in the movie. It feels like these movies start to run long. And I don't know exactly where the extra 15 minutes in a lot of these movies comes from. This one, I'm going to not really be concerned with that because it's a reboot and it's such an individual movie. But the regular movies that we're going to be seeing after this, or at least a lot more regular, I guess, than this, more normal, so to speak, for what we've seen on the timeline so far.
More status quo.
Yes, we're going more towards a status quo later. But those are an hour and 45 minutes, roughly. And I keep thinking when I watch them, where the extra 15 minutes come from. And I think part of this is the science-y...
exposition?
Uh-huh. And it's that... I think they thought somebody was interested in this kind of stuff, so they put it in the movie. I'm not. But because I think Godzilla is fantasy at the very core of its being. Even though there's a lot of sci-fi stuff that gets thrown around every once in a while. But I don't need to have the science stuff explained to me, and I don't know if I need G-force either. I was glad, though, that in this movie, the conversations and the scenes between people, the talking scenes, they're not talking about Godzilla all the time.
No, they're not.
They have their own lives. It's not... Godzilla is not the primary driver of everybody and their interests and their drive.
Yeah.
In the character list. Like... I like that a lot about this movie.
Yeah, I mean, there's even some points where the characters are dealing with their own sort of stuff. It doesn't happen terribly often, but I mean, as we mentioned, there's an entire sequence where they're not worried about Godzilla. They're trying to get out of a building.
Right.
Now, mind you, the building was damaged by Godzilla, so that's why they're trapped. But they're just trying to get out of the dang building. And yes, they're trying to get Dr. Hayashida's device where it needs to go. But you have these nice little quiet scenes between Goro and Naoko where she's just admitting that she's really scared. And she needed help with that. And it's only indirectly connected to Godzilla. It's more about her dealing with a very human thing, being afraid in a crisis. And it even kind of implies some attraction between the two of them.
Right.
So there's this very understated romantic subplot going
just like
on.
Every romantic subplot in these movies is understated.
Yeah, all of them are. But I found it really touching. And I was also glad that, because if this had been an American movie, by the time you got to the end of that scene, there would have been some smooching. And in this one, that doesn't happen.
Never does.
No. Except in Monster Zero. And you barely see it.
And it's not between two Japanese actors.
No. But I do think you're right. Their lives are not revolving around Godzilla, even though the things that they are dealing with at least have some sort of connection to him.
Mm.
Interesting fact we learned when on the most recent G-Fest when they had Shinji Iguchi over, he worked on this movie, uncredited.
He was showing us slides, pictures of him.
Yeah, he was uncredited, but he helped with the special effects in this.
Yeah, I would have loved to have worked on that one.
Yeah, which is really interesting because then he goes on to be co-director of Shin Godzilla, which I guess in some weird way makes sense because there are a few stylistic things that this film does that Shin Godzilla does later, such as when they introduce the governmental characters, they just put their name and title up on the screen and with subtitles.
Yeah, and then we get our subtitles with it.
Yeah.
I noticed that. There are a lot of subtitles in the Blu-ray. Yeah, but it's not a version of Shin Godzilla. Shin Godzilla is a version of it.
And it's little things like that and the heavy focus on politics that really in a lot of ways make this very much the predecessor to Shin Godzilla. So it's not like Shin Godzilla came completely out of left field with this.
Yeah, when I saw Shin Godzilla in the theater, that's all I could think of was, wow, they're redoing 84 only for modern times. And they did it very successfully.
What's interesting is we've been talking about the guy indirectly, but we get kind of a reboot version of a Showa era character in this, because our reporter is named Goromaki, and that was the name of the reporter from Son of Godzilla.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if they were just recycling the name, or I think he's the only character who gets rebooted from the Showa era in any of these movies.
You're probably right. There's a just like in King Kong versus Godzilla, we have a nuclear submarine being attacked by Godzilla.
Yes, that is true.
That's a connection to that.
But this time they flipped it, and it's a Soviet submarine and not an American submarine.
Yeah, and we get to see the Russian language and Japanese language on the screen, and then get it subtitled for us into English.
Yeah, that was a really surreal experience.
Also, we have an obvious connection to the Rodan movie, the original Rodan, because of the volcano and all that. So that's a connection to that. And also, just like in Mothra versus Godzilla, we have Godzilla stumbling and tripping and falling into a building.
This is also true.
We've come full circle, too, because both this and the original Gojira film have our characters refer to an American dinosaur book to do their research. Did you see that it was an American book and it said dinosaurs along the side?
No,
of it?
I didn't catch that.
And I swear I have that book.
You do?
I need to go find it. I think I have it.
That would be amazing if you did.
It's just a kid's book, I think. That's all it is. It's not like a research book. It's a picture book.
Why are these obviously brilliant scientists referring to children's dinosaur books?
American children's dinosaur books.
To boot.
Yeah, I think they did that in Godzilla Raids Again, too, with Anguirus.
Yeah.
They had the American book, and they were researching that.
We also have one returning actor in this film.
Hiroshi Koizumi.
Who plays a scientist.
Yeah, not our main scientist.
Not Hayashida.
The other scientist. Yeah, it was... you want to make sure that the character's right, but then it was supposed to be...
Oh, Hayashida was originally going to be played by Harada.
Harada, yeah.
Which is really interesting, especially when you consider that the character has connections, very personal connections, to the original attack from 1954. He said his parents died during that. So I think having Harada in that role would have been a nice
echo of the original
very
movie.
Nice echo. But unfortunately, Mr. Harada became ill when they started production and actually died not long after the movie was released. So we didn't get to see him again, unfortunately.
And that's part of what this movie was kind of about going on behind the scenes, from what I gather, is that we had a whole generation of crew and everybody who'd been making these movies all through the Showa era. And finally, they're starting to get old themselves. And then there's a new generation of movie creators that needs to be created here. There's a younger generation of people brought in to help with creating this movie. So we have the older generation passing on knowledge and communicating with the newer generation about how to make these movies, because there does have to be a generational transition at some point.
I chuckled a little bit during the scene when the Prime Minister's talking with his advisors, and as soon as the Prime Minister puts a cigarette into his mouth, that guy just leans right in and lights it for him. I'm thinking, is that your job?
Yes.
Are you the official cigarette lighter?
Yeah, is it like delineated in the official duties for what he has to do for the Prime Minister?
Like, light his cigarettes at all times.
Yeah.
As soon as it hits his mouth, boom. Another thing that I thought was just a little bit funny is there's a transition from one scene to the next when it's supposed to be being used to illustrate a point about making Mount Mihara erupt, if I remember correctly, and they're using what looks like a bottle of champagne, and the scene just starts with the cork popping off. So I was like, oh, wait a minute, are we breaking out the celebratory champagne or something right now?
Yeah. That was an interesting transition.
Wait. I was like, oh, wait, no, you're just illustrating a point. Okay.
And revealing Hiroshi Koizumi.
Yes.
That's when we first see him. And I think that's a way to... I think probably the audience that didn't know that he was going to be in it, they were shocked and they thought, oh, wow, it's a familiar face.
And then you had the bum that we see a couple of times toward the end of the movie, which I think he's probably the closest thing to actual comic relief in this. But he makes some... He does some very interesting things. It's almost satirical in a lot of ways, because he goes to a fancy restaurant that's been abandoned, and he gets a table all set up with all the fancy food, and he's about to sit down to eat, and then he gets interrupted by Godzilla. Mm-hmm. So, and he yells at Godzilla, like, "What are you doing?" Yeah,
and he calls him an out-of-towner.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Stupid out-of-towner. But I think it's kind of satirical because as we were mentioning, you have these disasters and they make people evacuate, but some people refuse and then they just stay. So I think it's kind of a play off of that.
Right. Yeah.
And it's also kind of funny because even though he's obviously a homeless guy, but he talks about how he's college educated. So I'm thinking that, why are you homeless?
I don't know. It's an interesting character.
Yeah. And then the last time we see him, he bumps into two of our main characters, and he makes a very interesting statement. He says, "Don't think of this as a disaster. Think of it as a chance," which is ironic because he's going around looting because he's carrying stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking, well, this is some more kind of interesting satire right here. But, kind of, again, playing off of the idea of, there are going to be people who are just going to take advantage of a situation like that.
Yeah. And instead of riots and stuff, it's just one guy.
Yeah. And then we see him running away from Godzilla, and Godzilla looks down and glares at him, and then he kind of does the same thing. He's like, "Oh, how dare you!" And then after that, we don't know what happens. So we don't know if Godzilla killed him or what. He just ends with him,
which more
shaking his fist at Godzilla.
That he's comic relief.
Yeah, but again, like I said, I think there's a touch of satire in that,
and also just any humor in this movie is not going to be in the kaiju part. It's going to be the human part of the plot.
Oh yeah. Then there's a scene right before that where Naoko and Goro are climbing down, and part of the building face has been ripped off, and she looks down, sees how far they have to go, freaks out a little bit, but then she looks forward and there's Godzilla coming at them. So it's like, don't look down, don't look forward.
Yeah, where are you gonna look?
Yeah, it's like, what are you gonna do? So I thought that was just a little bit humorous. I don't know if you remember this or not, but about the 62-minute mark with the Shinkansen, what was the deal with that hippie-looking dude who's just smiling as Godzilla picks up the train?
I don't know.
That was weird.
I noticed that every time, and I just thought, okay.
Because they bothered to make a shot, a very obvious shot on that guy, and he's smiling as this is all going on. I was like, what's the point of this?
I don't know.
Is it a piece of dark humor or something?
I thought maybe it was just a part of maybe how Tokyo is, like maybe the way like we look at New York with eccentric cab drivers with accents and stuff like this in movies that we've seen over the years. And it's just part of the eccentricity of that's Tokyo or something. Just like with the bum. I don't know.
Yeah, I could see that, but still, it was just struck me as odd.
Mm-hmm. Next, we'll get into all of the political and historical and economic everything that this movie has to do with, because it's a lot. It's so interesting, though, and we're just really going to elucidate this movie as much as we possibly can. This will be good. This concludes part 2 of the podcast.
You're listening to Kaiju Vision Radio.
In part 3 of the podcast, we discuss issues that were either brought up by the film directly or referenced, or events that were going on in Japan at the time the movie was released. So for this one, we have the acceleration of the Cold War, NATO's Able Archer exercise, Korean Airlines Flight 007, and the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. Now, we've had 9 years between this and the last movie, so it's been a long time that's passed. Here are a lot of events that occurred.
A lot of things have changed. Quite dramatically, actually.
Because the Cold War is such a central part of this movie, we're going to do the acceleration of the Cold War first.
This is really about the only real Cold War Godzilla movie. Some of the other ones hinted at it, but they weren't really about the Cold War.
Mothra was about the security treaty more than it was about the Cold War specifically, although Realistica is... there's some of that going on.
That's probably the closest I can think of.
Mm-hmm. But really, this blows that out of the water with just the amount of Cold War stuff that's going on in it at any given point in time, really. The early 80s were a warm-up of the Cold War, and part of this was related to the election of Ronald Reagan and also the kind of old men period of Soviet rule with Brezhnev and Andropov and a couple people after that like they were the premier of the Soviet Union for like a year or a couple of years, and they were always on their deathbed all the time, and and they were so old school, just ingrained with distrust and all this communist hardcore ideology from the good old days of the Soviet Union, and then here they are in the early 80s and they're relics of the past, and yet they still think the exact same way.
Yeah, and now they're dealing with an American president that has the guts to start doing things like calling the Soviet Union the evil empire.
And making references to the ash heap of history, wanting to relegate it. And when you talk about ash heaps, you sort of think about nuclear warfare a little bit in this context. And so there was a heating up of rhetoric, and there was a heating up of paranoia and of distrust. And so this escalated things. Also, Reagan, only after these incidents took place did Reagan truly realize and abhor nuclear weapons to the point that he did by the time his first term was over. But early on, he didn't have quite the appreciation for how things could happen so quickly, and also how something like a nuclear war could get out of hand by accident even, and there would be literally no time to react. The big picture is that only after these incidents and after this heat up took place did we know really that the Soviets were genuinely afraid that the United States would declare nuclear war on them and annihilate them from history. And this is something that I don't think Americans and the American government really knew to as full of an extent, that the distrust was that bad and they thought that Americans were going to nuke them. This fear we didn't register this fear with them. You know that you don't want to commit nuclear war, and yet your adversary thinks that you could at any time. And so that's a very dangerous dynamic to have, and that's one thing that's in this movie a lot, is the sort of threat of war could happen very, very, very easily.
Yeah, that was called mutually assured destruction, based off of the theory of deterrence. That's why the United States and Soviet Union were always beefing up their nuclear arsenals, because they wanted to make sure that the other one wouldn't pull the trigger first, because as soon as the trigger gets pulled, there goes the rest of the world.
Well, and that's what's at play here, is that isn't even enough at this point. When the Cold War heats up enough and someone thinks that an imminent nuclear attack is going to occur, the only strategy is what? Preempt that. And so you have to stop them first. And that is not what you want to be going on in the Cold War. You want mutually assured destruction rather than, they're going to attack us, we think, so let's preempt them and start a nuclear war that way.
Yeah, and President Reagan was not a fan of it. He likened mutually assured destruction to a suicide pact.
That it just goes back to the fact that Reagan was a little bit initially green about nuclear issues, and he didn't quite totally understand the dynamic. He actually hadn't attended those meetings for the first few years when the intelligence community and the military gets together and they did dry runs, like run-throughs of what a nuclear war would entail and what steps to take. And I had a political science professor who actually was in this kind of a job where they said, okay, if this occurs in a nuclear war scenario, what is the response and what do we hit and all this? And it was very theoretically based, and it was very trying to do it logically based too. It was actually kind of a scary field to be in once you actually think about that on a daily basis. But Reagan did not attend these meetings initially, and I think only after he attended these meetings, after this heat up of the Cold War occurred, did he he was reviled by nuclear weapons, and he was quite scared at just how ugly things could get so quickly.
One of the things that came out of it is he realized that the Russians, quote, feared us not only as adversaries, but as potential aggressors who might hurl nuclear weapons at them in a first strike. Interestingly, I guess this shouldn't be surprising given that Ronald Reagan was an actor in Hollywood for many years. He saw a television film called The Day After that really got to him because it was about a small town in the United States the day after a nuclear holocaust. He wrote in his diary that it, quote, left me greatly depressed.
Yes, and that's the reaction he should have had. You know, if anybody's human, they're going to react that way. But just thinking of a nuclear holocaust on someone else's individual level really brings the true horror of it right home, because that's the end of everything. And it's hard for our brains to imagine numbers that are really high or things that are as big as the planet. It is hard for us to think in the terms of billions of things versus trillions of things, and just large numbers like this, but also scales. It's harder for our brains to think on scales of this kind because it is a Earth worldwide scale problem and a disaster. It'd be a worldwide disaster. But this movie really goes into a lot about how paranoia can affect decision making and just how living in the Cold War was like. It was just like the children hiding under the desks. And that's the dynamic of the Cold War, really. Either side could completely blow up the other side, and you'd be caught in it, and there's nothing you can do. And there's the Cold War was a lot of people being resigned to just having to deal with this realization on their daily life. And it's not something you want to have to go through, really. But this is what was going on in Japan with things being so tense during the Cold War.
There were a handful of things that led to the paranoia that contributed to Able Archer. One being Operation Ryan, which was an extensive Soviet intelligence gathering program started in 1981. It charged Russian agents abroad to monitor those who could initiate a nuclear attack, personnel who could launch the attack, and facilities where the attack could originate. The goal was to detect the intent of a strike. Then there were also what were called PSYOPs, or psychological operations, where American naval vessels and military aircraft would fly as close as possible to Soviet territory before breaking away to test their radar range and look for gaps.
Operation Ryan was built entirely off of Soviet paranoia. It's all about, they're going to attack. Let's assume that they're going to attack. We just need to get advanced plans for where and when and how to try to stop it. If you're in Japan, you're familiar with this kind of thing because it is being done regularly by Chinese aircraft in the Senkaku Islands region and elsewhere. Also, if you're American, you also understand this because of Russian military planes buzzing our naval vessels, among other acts. And it is to find weak spots and to make sure that, and when you have to respond to these kinds of things because you want to demonstrate to them that you can meet that threat and repel it. And so this is a sort of game of chicken that's going on back and forth, and it does, over time especially, it antagonizes the other side for sure.
And then along those lines, you had what was called Fleet X-83. On April 4th, 1983, 6 aircraft flew over Zeleny Island to provoke a response from the Soviets and test their radar maneuvers and tactics. And then the Soviets responded with flyovers on the Aleutian Islands.
Yeah, so this is a tit for tat going on. And this kind of thing really between the Soviet Union and the United States has gone on for decades by the time we got to the 80s. All of these things are just, it's like one more antagonizing thing on the plate. And so we're stacking things up at this point.
There was also a false alarm detected by the Soviets' orbital missile early warning system, which was called SPERN, and it was codenamed OKO. It detected a ballistic missile launched from the U.S., but the technician on duty dismissed it as a computer error. A later investigation revealed it was due to a malfunction caused by rare weather conditions.
What was the reasoning? That, it's just one. Of course, they wouldn't just send one over. Then I thought, well, thanks. You logically thought it out. Good.
We're also talking about a massive weapons buildup during the Reagan administration, including the announcement of what was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or it was nicknamed Star Wars by the media. A lot of people think that actually got started by Senator Ted Kennedy because he was criticizing it, calling it Star Wars schemes. NATO's deployment of Pershing II missiles into Western Europe to counter Soviet SS-20 missiles along the Soviet border. The Star Wars stuff I find particularly interesting because a lot of it involved creating orbital lasers and particle cannons, even projectiles and missiles that could intercept ICBMs after they were launched. I find that interesting because that's what do we have in this? We have orbital nuclear platforms in this, which honestly is a little bit of a terrifying concept. The Soviets had toyed around with stuff like this back in the 60s with a program called FOBS, which was the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. Their goal was to put ICBMs into low orbit and then let them drop onto their target. It allowed them to expand their range, and they could attack North America going over the South Pole. That was the opposite direction than NATO's early warning system was oriented to detect them. They eventually abandoned it because the accuracy wasn't very good, and the missiles would come down at low angles, so it just wasn't effective. But then what happened was there was what was called the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, which actually outlawed the militarization of space.
There was throwing nukes all over a bunch of orbiting platforms, vessels, what have you.
Yeah. And there was
installations.
And there was actually some debate in those who were criticizing SDI were arguing that it somehow violated this, while those arguments were being countered by them saying, no, it's in too low of an orbit to be covered by the treaty and all of these things. But in a lot of ways, SDI, even though it was developing technology that found its way into other uses and purposes, in a lot of ways, it seems like it kind of operated a little bit as a bluff, because it was one of these things that the United States could hold over the Soviets to keep them scared in a lot of ways. And some Russian commentators have looked back on it and likened SDI to being like an economic war, because it forced the Soviet Union to spend extra money on defense. So they were hoping that the Soviet Union would then spend itself to death.
And SDI technology like this didn't get good immediately.
No.
It didn't get accurate immediately, and this wasn't something that you could just perfect and just have in the air in a couple of years.
No, it was mostly just a lot of research, a lot of ideas were getting thrown around. So I can see why, when it came time to write the screenplay for this movie, that you would include something like that. It would have been very much on people's minds. That's why you have the orbital nuclear platforms that both countries have.
Well, and then if you're just watching this from a layperson's point of view, you have the Cold War on top of you already, and then it's like, oh great, the Cold War is going to go into space now. This all messed around with mutually assured destruction, because if you have an anti-ballistic missile system in place, what can you do then? You can block a large amount, at least, of a nuclear attack. And so that way, if there was a functioning SDI system that the United States had, mutually assured destruction would be thrown out the window. And so that you're imbalancing things more than you're actually balancing them.
The Soviets were a bit unnerved by SDI, but they tried to cover it up by saying that if you introduce this technology, it's just a guarantee that nuclear war is going to happen.
There is also the idea that when you threaten the Soviets with an SDI system like this, you're giving them more pressure to actually give up developing more weapons, not only because they can't spend the money on it, but also just psychologically. It's kind of a psychological effect that you have when you're touting new technology to try to thwart them with, that they don't have a clue about how to get created yet. So what did the Pershing missiles do to the equation this time?
it increased a lot of tension because they were moved right up to the border.
And so we're increasing the range that nuclear missiles can go into the Soviet Union proper.
Yeah.
Because the Soviet Union was stationing these weapons in the Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe, and so we were placing the Pershing missiles in all of the bases in Western Europe. And so actions like the Able Archer exercise and moving the Pershing missiles around, that was a way to get a tactical advantage of first strike. You know, the idea of neutralizing the Soviet Union through a nuclear action and not getting hit back yourself. And you don't want somebody thinking that you're going to first strike them, just like you probably wouldn't want to conduct a first strike in the first place. But if you have an enemy that is concerned that you are trying to get a first strike, then what is the only remedy to that? For them to do the same thing. And then it's like the red buttons down the hallway, and there are two guys at the end, and they're both jostling each other, trying to see who pushes the button first. So about Able Archer.
This was a command post exercise carried out by NATO from November 7th to 11th, 1983. It was meant to simulate conflict escalation culminating in a DEFCON 1 nuclear strike.
And starting with chemical weapons usage.
Yeah, because this particular exercise included a greater level of realism, including coded messages, radio silences, and the involvement of government leaders around the world, I might add. And with relations between the US and USSR already deteriorating, the Soviets believed this was a ruse of war and put their forces in East Germany on high alert. They really thought this was a real thing. It was not an exercise.
Yes, this genuinely scared them.
Yeah, and I can totally understand why, especially with this, just how deep the simulation went. There aren't really any Soviet sources that talk about Able Archer, which has led some historians to think that that's a sign that the Soviets didn't think Able Archer presented that much of a threat. On the other hand, we have a Soviet double agent named Oleg Gordievsky, who was at one point resident in London, and he's the only Soviet source to report anything about Able Archer. He and many other Warsaw Pact agents were skeptical of a NATO first strike because they were close to the West and they understood where the Western nations were coming from. However, Soviet agents were ordered to report their observations and not their analyses, which fed the Soviet Union's fear of U.S. aggression. Seems like a little bit of an oversight, honestly. I would actually want some analysis of things as opposed to just telling me what you see happening.
Because everything's about intention with something like this. And so when you see somebody taking unprecedented measures, what may be a drill or what might not be a drill, then that becomes a huge issue.
Yeah, it's just, still, I would think that you're missing part of the story at that
Absolutely.
point. Yeah, and it just seems like a mistake on the Soviets' part to tell their agents to do that.
And I think it just goes back to them being completely old school and very paranoid. So during this exercise, it lasted a few days. Mm-hmm. What happened is that the Soviet Union readied their nuclear arsenal because they got that paranoid about it, because they noticed too many outstanding different things happening with communications and with military movements. And so they were actually so afraid that they were almost ready to conduct a first strike themselves. And so this was what catapulted us almost to as close of a place to nuclear war as what could have happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And then at the end of all this, President Reagan thought, how could they actually have thought that we were going to do that? I have no idea why would they think that. And that was the huge disconnect that had been revealed as a result of this massive increase in tensions, was that, wait, they actually thought we were going to do that? Wow. Suddenly we find out that the Soviets were actually scared to death of what we possibly could have done. Moving on to the Korean Airlines Flight 007, I don't know if maybe other people who are listening to this get a big excitement about this, but all of those specials on like the documentaries about all the plane crashes and all this and how they got caused and what the technical thing was and what wasn't repaired correctly and all these different reasons for why this happens. I think that people are very intrigued about plane crashes and all that. And even though I get into a plane, I'm fine. I don't think about that at all. I know that plane crashes are the chance of it happening is so minute. It's way safer than if you got in your car and started driving around. I mean, that's the way I've always looked at it. But this was something that was one of those super extraordinary cases. But this begins just like one of those documentaries where they mess up the two different kinds of navigation. And then they start going off course gradually. But the problem is that they were going off course gradually into the Soviet Union airspace and over the Kamchatka Peninsula, that's absolutely the wrong thing that could possibly happen. And of course, the pilot and the co-pilot did not realize that they were off course. And so then they started being monitored. And then because we're already in a very tense period between the U.S. and the USSR, this gets just put into overdrive with this very conspicuous plane that ends up on there and they don't know what it's doing. And so they have to figure out what it is.
This actually probably could have been avoided because the local technicians in that area who were supposed to be repairing the radar didn't. And they lied to Moscow about it. If they had been doing their job and had not lied, the radar probably would have been operational and they would have identified this as a civilian aircraft about 2 hours sooner.
Right. That's just like every other airplane crash documentary. If this hadn't happened, if this wasn't the circumstance, then everything would have been fine.
Yeah, but the Soviets honestly thought that this was a spy plane.
There were fighters that were scrambled, and the fighter pilot that shot the plane down, he realized that it was a Boeing aircraft and that there were blinking lights on the sides and everything, but he didn't tell his superiors that it was a Boeing plane, and he said, well, they didn't ask. And then they could have made radio contact with the plane. That would have explained the reason for what's going on. Then the pilots would have been like, oh yeah, we're in Soviet airspace. We need to figure out why that happened and then get out of here and get back on course. There was also the warning shots that he fired because there's no way that anybody would have seen those. It was night, and there wasn't any incendiary aspect to the ammunition that was being fired, and so that was useless too. But yeah, there are a lot of things that could have caused this to not happen. They could have been a lot more careful too themselves, but the paranoia, I think, it might have been what did it. So what happened? The missiles, it was 2 air-to-air missiles. They blew up outside of the back of the plane, and then that probably, what they say is it depressurized the entire cabin. And then it was something about possibly the nose of the plane and the front of it was broken up. And then the back of it was also broken up. So it created maybe some sort of massive wind tunnel out of the plane. And it apparently the passengers had enough time to put their oxygen masks on. And the period between when the missile hit the plane and when the plane crashed, it was 12 minutes. Whereas that's a pretty long time to have to be through that emotionally suffering period of time. And one reason why there weren't a lot of bodies found was because they were being ejected out of the plane the whole time that the plane was trying to regain airworthiness.
The plane finally crashed near Monoran Island, which is in the Sea of Japan, and there were 269 people, passengers and crew, aboard, including, I might add, 28 Japanese and 62 Americans.
One of them a congressman who is in charge of the John Birch Society, which is an anti-communist group, which really puts the icing on the cake with this kind of an incident.
And something I was thinking about when I was looking this up is I can understand why tensions escalated with this, because I was thinking back to World War I and the Lusitania. Yeah, where a German sub sank the Lusitania, and there were 128 Americans aboard it. And that eventually led to the United States getting into World War I.
Yes, very late into World War I, but they finally did. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, this is the kind of thing wars get started over.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. It was also terrible PR for the Soviets all the way around. It didn't matter because they had eventually, what was it, 5 days later? Like, they didn't even say they
took
did
them 5 days before they acknowledged, we shot it down.
And then they finally acknowledged it. And, when you've done that, it's even worse when you've said you didn't. And then 5 days later, you fess up to the whole world community and you realize it.
To add just a little bit more tension to everything, South Korea, since they were the owner of the aircraft, immediately named the United States and Japan as search and salvage agents, which made it illegal for the Soviet Union to salvage anything from the aircraft, assuming it wasn't found in Soviet territory. And then that made the United States legally entitled to use force against the Soviets if necessary to prevent them from retrieving anything from it.
Because of treaty obligations, yeah. And so it's already creating more tension. But the thing is, it did fall in international waters. And yet the Soviets did not tell us the location of the crash. And they even set up a fake search and rescue effort to throw us off.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't help that it's very difficult to determine territorial borders in open water, first off.
And the Soviets also found the flight recorders. So the Soviets hid a lot of things about this. And obviously they had a reason to, too. It was because they did it, and this was all on them, really.
And for a while after this, you had 4 countries, the Soviet Union, the United States, Korea, and Japan, all sending ships out to do search and rescue and then eventually salvage operations to find debris from the plane and bodies and all of that. And nobody coordinated anything with anybody at this point, especially the Soviets. So there was constant tension between all of them if they ran into each other, and they're hounding one another and just all kinds of things. They wouldn't share information, just nothing, which only, I think, made things that much tenser for everybody involved. But what's interesting, though, is most of the things that any of them were finding they would find some debris, they would find personal belongings, they found a lot of clothing. Weirdly enough, they were able to identify a lot of people by shoes. They would find shoes, and then they would bring those in, and then family members for the passengers would identify people based on the shoes. President Reagan was not very kind to the Soviet Union after this. He condemned what happened as, quote, the Korean airline massacre and, quote, a crime against humanity that must never be forgotten, and, quote, an act of barbarism and inhuman brutality. Whew, those are some strong words right there. And there were some pretty serious consequences for the Soviet Union after this. In what I guess some would say is a little bit of turnabout being fair play, Reagan had the FAA revoke the license of the Aeroflot Soviet Airlines to operate flights in the United States. Now, they could still land in Canada and in Mexico, but they couldn't come into the United States. And that actually forced a Soviet foreign minister to cancel his scheduled trip to the UN.
Yeah, because he couldn't
get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, or at least not easily. And that remained in place for 3 years.
Yeah, this was a punishment for what was a very, very huge mistake, cause of a significant human tragedy that I'm sure they, if they had to do it over again, that they would not have done this.
Mm-hmm. And then on September 12th, 1983, the Soviet Union had to use its veto power to block a UN resolution condemning it for shooting down the aircraft.
Yeah, since they have veto power, they can do whatever they want in that department, but it doesn't matter. It's the fact that they were forced to veto it is even more of an indictment on them.
And as you would imagine, this incident in particular was one of the things that catapulted the anti-Soviet sentiment around the world, but especially in the United States.
Yes, this was a very, very, like I said, very bad PR for the Soviet Union, especially with the United States, but also South Korea and other nations that of the people who died in the incident.
We bring this up because we think this was probably the inspiration for Godzilla attacking the Soviet submarine, which creates an international incident that the Soviets take quite a bit of umbrage with. It's just that it's juxtaposed and reversed a little bit, where in this case it's the Soviets who are the victims as opposed to an aircraft near U.S. Soviet territory.
And this is one of the opening events in the movie, and it catapults everything into a much more serious situation as the movie goes on. And then it's Japan that ends up completely clearing the United States from wrongdoing, but only because they released the secret information about the fact that Godzilla did it, because, oh yeah, Godzilla exists now. And so that is also related to how the United States, in order to pin everything on the Soviets, we gave out information from spy planes and everything else that showed where the Korean aircraft was. And so that's another interesting parallel, is that Japan had to release secret information in order to absolve the United States of wrongdoing, while in real life, it was the United States divulging information that was beforehand secretly collected in order to get all of the data possible about the shooting down of the aircraft.
And also keep in mind, the Soviets' immediate reaction was that it was the United States that did this, which parallels this event that we're talking about, because all during the search and salvage operations, each side was constantly trying to pin the other for blame.
In 1979, we had the worst nuclear accident in the history of the United States, and that was the 3 Mile Island accident that occurred in Pennsylvania.
And this is relevant because this accident was part of the inspiration for producer Tomoyuki Tanaka to revive the Godzilla franchise and get it back to its anti-nuclear roots.
Because this event galvanized the anti-nuclear movement, especially in the United States, but also all over the world, because it demonstrated how nuclear power plants can have very critical problems occur without as much protection and safety as was necessary. After reading about this, I realized nuclear power is really expensive, especially in this case.
Yeah.
Because the 3 Mile Island facility was commissioned in 1974 for Unit 1 and 1978 for Unit 2. And Unit 2 is where the accident occurred. And so December 30th, 1978 was when it came online. And then the nuclear accident occurred March 28th, 1979. So that's 3 months in service.
Oops.
The total construction cost for both units was $1.5 billion. And then the cleanup for the accident was $1 billion. And then $2.4 billion in property damage for a unit that was on this long.
The cleanup operation for this accident lasted 14 years. 3 months in service, 14 years cleaning up after it.
Yeah, and billions of dollars. And so this wasn't a very good cost to benefit ratio for this facility by any means. The facility is actually going to be closed down in 2019, at least. It's planned for that.
Yeah, one reactor has already been shut down, and then the other one was originally intended to stay in operation in some form or another until about 2034, but because of financial pressures and such, they're going to apparently shut it down in 2019.
And part of that is because natural gas is so cheap. And so it's extremely hard to compete with the natural gas industry at this point. Related to the actual error that took place, the gist of it is that the instruments that were telling people what was going on were not clear, and then they were also not understood correctly. And so the problem lasted way longer than it should have. And then finally, when the replacement staff came in for the next shift, they were like, oh, you just do this and that and the other. What in the world did you guys do?
Nothing?
Oh, well, we didn't think that was doing that. Well, clearly you weren't looking at it right. And so it was human error for the vast majority of this that caused it.
With a little bit of mechanical failure.
Mm-hmm. And just failure to diagnose the problem was, I think, the biggest issue.
Poor training on the part of those who were working in the facility at the time.
And instruments that could have been a little more clear. Because this is a nuclear reactor, it is very complex. You want to have indicators and buttons and lights and stuff that show exactly what in the world is going on in your nuclear power plant when you build it.
Yeah, especially since you do one thing wrong and the results are a bit catastrophic.
Yeah, such as melting down half of the uranium that is at the facility, which was really bad. It's amazing how there wasn't a massive release of this radioactivity when the accident occurred. It is very much a very close call. And I think that's what galvanized the nuclear movement, the anti-nuclear movement, is that look at what all happened, but look at what could have happened. This was a close call, and it could have been way, way worse. And so this drove home just how volatile these nuclear plants.
Yeah, Brian. In fact, in New York City, in September of 1979, there were over 200,000 people who gathered for an anti-nuclear demonstration. Speeches were given by Jane Fonda and Ralph Nader, and it was held in conjunction with a series of nightly, quote, no nukes concerts at Madison Square Garden from September 19th to 23rd by Musicians United for Safe Energy.
And this sounds quite a lot like the protests that happened in Japan after the detonation of Castle Bravo.
Yeah, and also in May of 1979, there was an estimated 65,000 people, including, I might add, California Governor Jerry Brown, who attended a march and rally against nuclear power in Washington, D.C. So there was a huge outpouring of anti-nuclear sentiment in the United States this time. I mean, we're used to seeing it in Japan with what we've been talking about in this podcast, but then we had some of it here in this country.
Yeah, and this also, it really reduced the desirability for more plants to be built in the United States. This was what threw cold water all over that, because throughout the 1970s, nuclear power plants were a popular thing. They were being built a lot more, but this really threw a wrench in the whole process for getting new ones to be built, because there haven't been very many new ones built in the United States after this happened.
Think of it like this. From 1963 to 1979, except for 1971 and 1978, the number of nuclear power plants being commissioned and built in the United States was increasing. And then it dropped dramatically starting in 1980 through 1998. In fact, 51 reactors were canceled just between 1980 and 1984.
Wow.
The U.S. nuclear industry was growing exponentially at this point, but then it got halted by the accident, as you might expect. In 1979, 129 nuclear plants were planned, but only 53 which weren't in operation were completed. And then in subsequent years, federal requirements to correct safety issues and design deficiencies became more stringent, local opposition became more strident, and construction times were significantly lengthened, and costs skyrocketed. It wasn't until 2012 that a new nuclear power plant was authorized for construction.
Yeah.
That long.
It made the process a lot more expensive to build them, along with all this other effects that it had. And so it really changed the nuclear industry a great deal. I think probability is what explains a lot of the problems with nuclear plants, is because it's hard to make the probability of something to go wrong zero. And then when something does go wrong, the chances of it being really bad is quite high. And also there's all of these numbers when we look up nuclear plants about, well, it's one in so many tens of thousands every year that says that an earthquake, seismic activity, or an earthquake under a nuclear power plant could threaten the power plant itself. And you don't want it to be in the tens of thousands, right? You want it to be more than that. And so it's nuclear power plants can be a liability just because of just random chance.
Yeah, it seems like nuclear power plants are, in a lot of ways, kind of like airplanes. It's supposed to be a safe form of energy, but then on those rare occasions where something goes wrong, it goes very, very wrong, and there are dire consequences.
Hundreds of people getting killed, and
yeah. And so it becomes this big event that everyone is paying attention to, and it makes everyone stop and rethink everything.
And nuclear power plants are just so utterly complex, and then problem solving becomes unbelievably complex. And the more complex something is, the more unsustainable it can be, and the more things that can be done to make it not work right.
Looking at this accident and realizing that it was part of what inspired Tanaka to bring Godzilla back and go back to its roots, you can see that evidenced a little bit in this, because what happens? We have Godzilla attacking a nuclear power plant. And there's a lot of stuff going on now in Japan related to nuclear power plants, especially in light of Fukushima. So I feel like in a lot of ways, this movie was a little bit ahead of its time, bringing up the nuclear power plant issue, because that's what's bringing, at least initially, what is bringing Godzilla to Japan.
The other thing that this got really ahead of time was just by 2 years, was because Chernobyl happened in 1986, which was far, 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 far worse than the Three Mile Island incident ever was.
Yeah, and there's a scale that's used to rate nuclear accidents. I think it goes from a scale of 1 to 7. 3 Mile Island was a 5. Chernobyl was a 7.
Yeah,
but it was like a really, really high 7.
Yeah, related to nuclear power plants, there actually are no power plants that are nuclear in Indiana at all. In our state, there were actually 2 nuclear plants that were planned. One was unfinished, and it was half finished when it was stopped. And that $2.5 billion was sunk into that project. Then there was another proposed power plant, and that was canceled in 1981, which was probably one of those many ones that were canceled. And so we don't even have any nuclear power plants in the state. There are a number of ones that other states have around us. So there actually isn't a single one here. I doubt that there will be, just because there are so few of them being built at this point.
Yeah. Hey, Brian, have you ever seen the movie The China Syndrome?
I actually still have not, although one of my favorite actors, Jack Lemmon, is in it.
I haven't seen it either. Maybe we should watch it together sometime. But what's interesting is that movie opened a week or two before the 3 Mile Island accident, and it's about a nuclear power plant accident.
Yeah, I mean, this is really amazing that there aren't very many instances where a movie about something drops and then the thing that the movie is talking about actually happens. Yeah, shortly after.
It's a little bit freaky. In fact, ironically, we mentioned that Jane Fonda was part of the anti-nuclear movement that spawned off of this. She starred in the movie, and I'm pretty sure she used that to her advantage. Say, hey, look, I was in a movie about this. You should pay attention to me.
I think that galvanized the movement more, was because everybody thought, okay, let's go see the movie now. And because this just happened in real life, let's go see the movie. And it's like, wow, that's eerie.
I'm sure the everyone involved in the movie was a little bit appreciative of that, but they probably would have preferred that it came under better circumstances.
Yeah, but the protests did have an impact, just like all the protests after Fukushima in Japan. They had a big impact because a lot of the power plants have not been restarted to this day, and there is very significant court cases, political battles that are taking place over restarting these plants.
Well, and there was lots of legal and illegal battles going on with this immediately afterward. Insurance companies are paying out millions in compensation, and it's just all kinds
class
of
action suits. Class action suits filed, and then they couldn't talk about what happened to them.
Yeah, it was just crazy. Yeah, it was just crazy. Just the amount of backlash, I guess you could say, that came out of this
in many different forms, as it tends to do.
It's probably the closest thing that we in the United States have experienced to the 3/11 disasters in Japan.
Yeah, that too. Nuclear power plants are also a liability in, I guess we've been talking about nuclear war games and stuff. Nuclear power plants are often the targets of nuclear bombs too, because they power cities and because you'd be spreading even more radiation and disaster and stuff onto the unsuspecting country that you were bombing. And so a lot of these plants are a liability in that respect too. And of course, terrorist attacks, yada, 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 weather disasters, earthquakes, tsunami, if you're in Japan, and any nuclear plants that are on the coasts, there's a lot of risk, huge amount of risk associated with nuclear power plants. I think at the time that they started being built, they were really viewed as the clean power of the future, and now it's just a lot of a mess.
Yeah, I think this incident really gave a lot of people a pause for concern and really made them stop and think about these things a little bit more and weigh the cost and benefits more so than they probably would have before this.
And then Chernobyl happened, and then nobody needed to argue anything about how unsafe nuclear power was.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, Chernobyl kind of dwarfed this particular accident. I mean, and it
vindicated this movie too, and its anti-nuclear stance, and just how dangerous things are. And it definitely vindicated the China syndrome again, as did Fukushima and all these other incidents that have occurred. One reason why this movie was purportedly made was because so much time had passed, 30 years in between the original film and this one, and it was about getting the Japanese public to not forget. Because did you run into this? That the creators of the film that's why they brought back a standard original Godzilla movie like this.
Interesting.
In order to get the public to realize, oh yeah, even though we've come this far along after the war ended, this brought back the old style Godzilla that damaged everything and that was angry, and this brought back the more visceral parts of Godzilla about disasters and just the nuclear bomb.
Yes,
this was a movie to make the public more sober about these issues, because the war didn't happen that long ago, and so you still need to instill that feeling into a new generation of people,
especially in the era that it was made, when you had a lot of heightened tension, when Japan was finding itself a little bit more involved in the Cold War, because you had the prime minister in this having to stand up for those principles that are very distinctly Japanese, against a lot of international pressure, and against those who were telling them that they were not only in the wrong, but that they were arrogant for such ideas, and
principles weren't realistic.
Yeah, and that it just wasn't the time. That's what the American was saying. This isn't the time to talk about principles. Mm-hmm. We have to think about the immediate problem at hand. But I'm sure the prime minister is thinking, I don't want to be the guy who authorizes another bomb to be dropped on Japan.
Yeah,
I don't want that.
That's why they had that scene. And it was to bring the gravity of the whole situation home. And this whole movie was a way to remind the public of, this is where we stand, and this is where we should stand. And it's a very nationalist film in that respect. It very much, it gets the idea across of what Japanese values are in a time of crisis. And it reminds all of the Japanese viewers that, yes, we did go through that. And it was a while ago now, but we still remember it. And we're still going to forge ahead based on the ideals that came out of the terrible tragedy of the war and the bombings and all the suffering.
Which is something that I will confess to you that's a theme that really resonates with me. Seeing characters who stand by their principles regardless of the amount of pressure that's being put on them. you can see, and that's a theme that you can see reflected in personal stories. You can see that reflected in comic book stories, action stories, but you can also see it in stuff like this that's more about political drama. You can see it on a national scale because essentially the prime minister is speaking on behalf of his nation and saying, this is where we stand as a nation, and we will not waver from it.
He's probably one of the most heroic politicians I've ever seen in a movie, too, because usually the movies view politicians through a realistic view, but this time around,
a very cynical lens.
There's no cynical anything with this prime minister. He does act quite heroic. And again, we have a movie that is psychological healing through disaster. This is just like the first movie, where we have a new Tokyo, a new Japan that is now being destroyed by Godzilla again, and so we're bringing home the whole don't forget thing too with this as well. It's pretty indisputable also that the military and politicians are looked at in a much more positive light in this movie. And this is 100% different from Hedorah, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was probably the nadir of military competence and ability and the view of it. And so we've come full circle now where like 1954, that film, it didn't have it was rather ambiguous on what people thought of the military. But this time around, the military is effective. It has leadership. Even though they still get destroyed and all that, they're trying their hardest.
Yeah, they're still completely outmatched.
But it's a lot more positive light on the military and of politicians that are in charge of the country. It is patriotic in that respect, and it's more, I guess, nationalistic, if you would want to use a word. It's not, nobody's worshiping the military here, clearly, but we definitely have come a long way from the 1960s and 70s films that really the military is not looked at as much of a positive force. The volcano in this movie, it didn't erupt really right before this, but there is a volcano that did erupt, and it was Mount Oyama, and it erupted in 1983, which is very close to this. And so I'm not sure if it was also a volcano that was in the Izu Island chain as well. So it was very close to the mountain the volcano that Godzilla actually goes into. But I think maybe this volcanic eruption on Mount Oyama, that might have been the impetus for the volcanic eruption in the movie.
And interestingly, Mount Mihara did erupt in real life 2 years after the movie was released.
Economically, the Japanese were doing extremely well, all during the period in between Terror of Mechagodzilla and today's movie, from 1975 to 1984. The GDP of Japan in 1975 was about $500 billion. By the time it got to 1984, $1.29 trillion. And so GDP has more than doubled in this period of time.
That is astonishing.
Economic growth in 1975 was 3%, and then 4.5% almost in 84. The bigger the number gets, it doesn't matter as much what the percentage increase is, but the higher the percentage increase with a big number, that's when you have even larger growth. And all throughout the 1980s, the economy of Japan is really, really growing and adding on. And we aren't getting as high of percentages, but the amount of economic growth in that percentage is massively high.
It just wouldn't be an episode of Kaijuvision Radio without Japanese economic figures, listeners.
One prelude to our next movie, in 1977, Japan agreed to what was called the Orderly Marketing Arrangements. And what it did was it limited exports on products that were causing political problems in the U.S. because of the influx into the United States economy. And this was stuff like color TVs, steel, and textiles. And it was because the competition in the United States was getting hurt because of these products coming in. And so it was creating political tensions and political problems over the issue of trade. And this is something that we will see in the future as we discuss these movies during the 90s. Dovetailing with that, in 1980, the U.S. trade deficit to Japan reached $10 billion a year.
Oh my.
So there is starting to be a large amount of money coming from the United States into Japan in the form of a trade deficit. And so that has also increased a little bit of tensions over that period of time leading up to this movie. Our next episode should be very different because this is a very different movie. We're going back to an American version of a Godzilla movie.
Yep, the heavily edited, Americanized version of this film entitled Godzilla 1985.
Which is from the year 1985, in case you were wondering.
Yeah, in case you were wondering. Brought to us courtesy of a little studio called New World Pictures. Thank you, Roger Corman.
In case you don't know who Roger Corman is, look up some of his wonderful films that he has released over the years. I'm being facetious. I watch Mystery Science Theater. It is a very radically different movie, to say the least. It is I very much like this version better. And so we'll explore Godzilla 1985 and just see what we can make out of it. It should be a fun episode.
In a very MST3K sort of way, I'm sure.
We'd like to send a shout out to our patrons Kyoei, Toshi, and Sean Stiff for pledging at the Kaiju Visionary level. Thank you for your support. We really appreciate it.
If you'd like to get a hold of us and send us some feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is feedback@kaijuvision.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook.
Our podcast is available on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, Blueberry, TuneIn, Podcast Addict, our YouTube channel, and on our website, kaijuvision.com. Thanks to Audiophiliac for creating our theme and bumper music, www.fiverr.com/audiophiliac. If you like our podcast, please support us on Patreon.
I'm Nathan Marchand, and I'm the podcast webmaster.
And I'm Brian Scherschel, and I edited this podcast. Sayonara.